In January 2025, I recorded an episode of Inside Your Ed titled Will the Debate over Vocational and Technical Qualifications Ever End? It is therefore rather fitting that my final podcast of 2025 will prove beyond all reasonable doubt that this debate shows no sign of ending anytime soon. In November this year, the Independent Curriculum and Assessment Review proposed the creation of V-levels, a new set of vocational qualifications for 16 to 19-year-olds that are intended to sit between academic A-levels and technical T-levels. The government accepted this recommendation and has since launched a consultation on the design and implementation of V-levels in order to get these new qualifications ready for September 2027. So what problems are V-levels supposed to solve? What opportunities and risks lie ahead for learners and providers with this new brand of qualifications? And will V-levels be seen as a prestigious choice for young people, or will they struggle to compete with A-levels and T-levels in terms of their visibility and profile? My guests are Professor Dame Alison Wolfe, DBE, the Sir Roy Griffiths Professor of Public Sector Management at King's College London and author of a government review of vocational qualifications in 2011, and Sean Hope, the principal of Bishop Auckland College, which delivers further education, vocational training and higher education to over 4,000 students across Durham. I'm Tom Richmond, and to decide whether young people need V-levels alongside A-levels and T-levels, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
I think the best place to start our conversation is by pointing out that this government has now joined the increasingly long list of recent administrations from different political parties who have, for various reasons, decided that something must be done to reform vocational qualifications in schools and colleges. Alison, for the benefit of any listeners who may not be too familiar with this part of our education system, how would you describe the journey that we've been on with vocational qualifications for 16 to 19-year-olds over the past 20 years or so?
Winding and basically swallowing its own tail a lot of the time. And actually, you need to go back more than 20 years. It's actually very, very depressing. We have had, as you say, Tom, a whole series of initiatives, qualifications that came and went and are long forgotten. I doubt if more than 2% of the people who will listen to this will ever have heard of the CPVE. Look it up. A few more will have heard of GNVQs, vocational A-levels. It just goes on and on. And I actually think that to some extent there is a real problem, which is that we don't have clear alternatives to A-levels that everybody understands. But I also think there's quite a lot of displacement activity, that because we don't actually know quite what we want to do particularly in the last 2 years of school, which now enroll almost everybody, and that's of course a big change. And because we worry endlessly about, and with reason, about young people and how well they enter the labour market if they don't go straight on into university, there's been a tremendous tendency to displace the many, many decisions that you might have to make onto, I know what, let's create a new qualification and that will solve the problem. I think there are diminishing returns, by the way. If I go back in history, and I think it's the 1990s, the GNVQs, when they were first launched, there was actually a real appetite for them. I remember that the government said we want 25% of what would be year 12, I guess, to be doing either an advanced or an intermediate GNVQ within a couple of years. And the first year they were well on track. 18 months in, it was beginning to fall off. And basically because they didn't work, I think they could have been fixed, but they were abolished instead. Because they didn't work, there's now, and I don't know whether Sean will agree on this, there's now a pretty well-lodged folk memory that these qualifications are to be treated with suspicion. And I think it's going to be very hard to overcome that.
Okay, so that's the fascinating and quite remarkable historical context into which these new V-levels have emerged. Sean, from what we have seen and heard thus far, which isn't too much admittedly, but we've had the curriculum and assessment review have their say, and the government's also got a new consultation on V-levels. So what can we say about why V-levels have been created and the role they are supposed to play in our 16 to 19 system?
Thanks, Tom. Yes, what are V-levels and why are they being created? What it appears to be is an attempt to simplify what is quite a complex qualification landscape across post-16 education. And if it's right, it'll look at a simplified model to create the three separate pathways, whether that's academic, technical or vocational. But there's so much we don't know at this moment in time, probably significantly more than what we do know. So we've seen from Becky Francis and her expert panel of advisors for the Curriculum and Assessment Review the proposal that V-levels should look at a broad sector-based and applied approach to vocational qualifications, interestingly looking at different sizes depending on which sector it serves and how that best fits, if you like. Then shortly after that, a number of weeks after that, we get the Department for Education's post-16 white paper that similarly says that the route is to create that single pathway for vocational qualifications, but instead talks about all of them being A-level size. Goes a little bit further to talk about non-exam assessments and closer alignment or occupational standards. So what we've got in the broad intent seems sensible to look like academic, technical and vocational, but the devil will be in the detail. And already just from two documents, which we've seen, two lengthy documents we've seen, we're already seeing discrepancies and probably leaving myself and many other leaders in the whole sector thinking, what is that detail and when does it come?
Well, you mentioned discrepancies. Let's talk about some of these discrepancies because we are not short of them, as you say. I mean, the first thing that caught my attention was the specific language being used to describe V-levels. The Curriculum and Assessment Review talked about them being ambitious and high quality, but it also said that V-levels should support the significant proportion of young people for whom A-levels and T-levels, quote, are not suitable, particularly students from disadvantaged backgrounds and those with special needs. The government's V-level consultation then accepted that most 16 to 19-year-old students who study vocational qualifications at the moment have lower GCSE grades than those who study A-levels. So, quote, we believe that V-levels need to be attainable for the average student currently taking applied general qualifications, which are the current brand of vocational courses. Sean, I can't help feeling that there is a real tension here between wanting V-levels to be seen as aspirational and ambitious, but also wanting them to be targeted specifically at students who did not get great GCSE results. Can the government really achieve both things, or are they going to have to choose between these goals at some point?
Be careful that the whole podcast isn't taken over by my opinions on some of the language that's being used. But early on, that language is giving us an indication of how government are seeing these. Just for the record, there can be someone who hasn't achieved those high grades at GCSEs and is still extremely ambitious with a vocational expertise. I'll think of some of my catering students who go on to be top-class chefs and have found their ambition and their purpose as they join those programs. So I'm reluctant to say ambition follows a set of results that you achieved at the age of 16, and that determines what the rest of your life looks like. However, the government using language like that can be perceived as lowering the expectations of some students and therefore lowering the expectations of what these qualifications can and should be about. For me, the key here is how ministers, and therefore all of the officers then that roll out these qualifications, how they perceive them to be. Because if at the outset their intent is that they are a lesser qualification, almost like a catch-all for those who haven't fit nice and neatly into a A-level or T-level route, well then already we're creating a divide between our students. We're not creating a genuine opportunity for students to choose one of the three. What should be highly ambitious should also be high performing and perceived to be by everybody that they're a great route, whatever your intentions are.
Alison, we've seen A-levels and more recently T-levels repeatedly described by ministers as the gold standard of academic and technical qualifications, respectively, but I'm not seeing that kind of language appear anywhere in relation to V-levels. Do you think V-levels could ever become prestigious qualifications if the government also wants them to be accessible qualifications?
Brutally, no. I mean, you can't have both things. You can't have something which is seen as the top and something which is seen as everybody. I mean, that doesn't mean I'm saying that everybody can't have a good education. What I'm saying is that if what you're talking about is a hierarchy, not everybody can be at the top of a hierarchy. I mean, that's what a hierarchy is. It's something, some people are at the top and some people aren't. Just about every country in the world has got a well-established academic route, which is well recognised, which you fiddle with at your peril. Nobody ever manages to actually really, in the modern world, to really reform their main academic university route qualification. I mean, or at least I say this frequently and nobody has yet produced a counterexample. But I think that what puzzles me a bit, or surprises me a little bit about the V-level discussion, is that it keeps ducking the elephant in the room, which is BTECs. And the reality is that BTECs have for a long time now provided a very large cohort of people, many of whom don't yet know what they want to do, will frequently, in fact, combine a BTEC with one A-level, who will have decent GCSEs, but not top GCSEs, and who will provide at least 25% of an incoming undergraduate cohort. And somehow we've finessed that particular group of students out of the room and assumed that what we can create is a vocational qualification, a V-level, which they will all want to do. I have no idea what went on in terms of the discussion among the experts when Becky Francis was doing this. But I did look back at the Sainsbury Review, because Sainsbury Review, which produced T-levels, which was now quite a while ago, is frequently presented now as having said everybody will do A-levels or T-levels. It didn't. It said a lot of people will do either A-levels or what we then called applied general qualifications, or they will go a vocational route, and we need to improve the vocational route or the occupational route. We've now slid back to what was actually the language of the 1990s, in which you have an academic group and everybody else is doing something which is somehow vocational. And what I don't see the review or the white paper grappling with is the fact that you've got a very large number of young people who are in full-time education, who haven't chosen an occupation, who aren't going to do well at A-levels if they go in for them, but actually want what is effectively a classroom-based qualification, possibly with some strong technical or vocational content, but which is essentially a qualification that leads them on to a variety of things, not something which involves an occupational choice. And those 17 and 18-year-olds aren't going to go away.
You mentioned the Sainsbury Review. So for our listeners who aren't too familiar with this was a review by Lord Sainsbury in 2016, which was the origins of what are now known as T-levels. Alison, you were a member of the panel working on that review. So I'm interested in whether you think V-levels have any implications then for T-levels, because Lord Sainsbury clearly wanted to raise the profile of technical qualifications. Alison, do you think that V-levels can appear without having any effect on the T-levels that the government have been working on now for about 10 years?
I mean, the answer is I'm sure they can't, but I don't yet know what the impact will be, because T-levels are also something that has mutated somewhat from what the Sainsbury Review forecast. But I did just want to make this point that, we've had the advent of T-levels, and it is perhaps worth, even though what we're talking about here is V-levels, going back a bit to why the Sainsbury Review was created. And it relates a bit to what Sean was saying about this complex mass of qualifications that we've acquired in this country, and where we do indeed historically have a much more kind of complex scene, particularly for 16 to 18-year-olds, than is the case in most other developed countries. The idea behind the Sainsbury Review was, in fact, to try and clarify the routes on offer, and particularly to try and create some really high-quality occupational options that people recognise. So it was a little bit like V-levels. In a sense, it was a sort of nationalisation of the many, many competing and clearly occupational qualifications that were being marketed to colleges and to a much lesser extent schools. Now, it didn't turn out as cleanly as that. There have been a lot of issues to do with T-levels, which probably deserve a podcast all on their own if they haven't already had 6, Tom. But the basic idea of sort of clarifying things was there. And in that sense, I think, the idea of a V level makes sense. It's A levels, V levels, T levels. At least you can get your head around that. The problem arises when you don't actually have a very clear idea, other than the fact that you want a label, what should go inside. I think I'm really just saying the same thing over and over again as a Sean, that until we know what's inside that box marked V levels, it's really very hard to know whether it's going to actually deliver on any of the things which we know we're not doing very satisfactorily at the moment.
Sean, as a college leader, you've had the unenviable task, I suspect, of trying to keep up with all these reviews and reforms and ministerial changes of opinion over the past 10 years or so. I'm assuming, looking at the Bishop Auckland website, that you now deliver lots of T-levels. So you've been really trying to build up that part of your provision in line with where the government was previously going over the last 10 years. And yet now something else is being thrown into the mix. You mentioned this point around simplicity. The government has said in writing that the aim of V-levels is to provide, quote, simplicity and clarity. So when you're looking at this as a college principal, the introduction of V-levels, are you seeing more simplicity or are you seeing more confusion here?
To use what is now an old Ofsted term, intent and implementation, I think the intent of T-levels, the intent of V-levels, what we know so far, is the correct intent. However, the detail that comes in the implementation is where this gets really confusing. So to go back and look at T-levels before we look forward at V-levels, has this been implemented in the way that it was intended? I really don't think so. I think Alison covered that very well, that we've seen a rehash of this embarrassingly for government multiple times. But I can give you a slightly different perspective, having a daughter in year 11 who isn't looking down an academic route, and her school absolutely have no idea of the differences between a T-level or any other route that's available to them. So I like the intent of making it simple, easy to understand, almost like a marketing tool. There's nearly 900 qualifications in that V-level, what will be a V-level basket. If we can't get the T-level basket right, and it's definitely not right at this moment in time, I don't know how long it's going to take to get this 900 plus qualifications in the V-level basket to be something that is workable and, most importantly, gives the students that study those the best opportunity to succeed and progress.
So one of the reasons that we have so many qualifications is to do with size. Now, Sean, you mentioned this earlier. I think this is worth dwelling on for a little bit, because for listeners who are only really familiar with the academic GCSE and A-level route, it may seem rather odd to talk about disputes over the size of qualifications because academic courses are almost always 2 years long. But the vocational landscape contains courses of different sizes, ranging from the equivalent of around half an A-level up to, in some cases, as much as 3 A-levels in size. Now, the Curriculum and Assessment Review said that V-levels should in most cases be the same size as 1 A-level to allow students to combine A-levels and V-levels, as many of them do now with something like A-levels and BTECs, as Alison was saying. But the review also thought that some larger V-levels might be useful in particular sectors or maybe where T-levels are not available. The Department for Education has come out and said, quote, having both large V-levels and T-levels will create confusion, and they, quote, remain committed to T-levels being the only large qualification. Sean, this all feels a bit technocratic in some respects, but I can imagine the size and shape of V-levels will have a big impact on colleges when trying to design your curriculum offer and meet the needs of students as well, particularly when so many existing qualifications, as you were saying, are much bigger than A-levels. So should students have the option of larger V-levels in some subjects, or is that just going to make the situation worse?
Again, the devil is in the detail and very much sector-based. There's some qualifications I can see where this will work, and there'll be benefits to that mix and match between A-levels and V-levels, or small V-level qualifications paired together. If I think of the health sector, sports sector, and pairing that with science qualifications, for example, then I can see other sectors where they are big qualifications, often with significantly more enrichment activity that goes on, something like performing arts, for example, which I can't see how you break that down into, say, 2 or 3 V-level size qualifications without it being done just for the sake of it, just for size, when really it's not the right thing that sector needs. So yes, it really does matter. Then it comes to the practicalities of how you roll that out. My college is one of the country's smallest. We're in a semi-rural area. That serves our community extremely well. We don't offer A-level provision. There's another A-level provider in our town, and it would be silly of us to compete with that A-level provider. Similarly, it'd be silly with them to compete with us from a vocational and technical perspective. But as the proposals are, if these are rolled out, this would mean that we all would need to offer all of the qualifications. And then you're talking extremely small class sizes that are not economically viable. So in turn, what you get is a limited offer because a college can't make it economically viable by putting the full breadth of offer on. So yes, I can see and it's typically is, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's typically from people who've studied just an A-level route who are creating these things, who are then saying this is the way it should work because it worked well when they studied at college many, many moons ago.
Alison, I think it's fair to say that the debate over the size of T-levels is still going on now, about 10 years on, because in some respects they work as being very large qualifications themselves, about the size of 3 A-levels, but other people aren't a huge fan of that model. And yet here we are debating the size of V-levels too. What do you make of the department wanting to take a very rigid approach, but maybe that doesn't work for the sector?
Okay, well, let's take T-levels first, because I think they have to be big if they're going to be anything close to what they were supposed to be. I mean, you can't have lots of sort of A-level size T-levels existing side beside each other and still be doing a coherent and good pathway which involves sizable amounts of workplace experience. I mean, they have to be big. 2 years of 3 terms of school it's not actually that much if what you're trying to do is to give as many things as you are in an occupational qualification like a T-level, which is as close as you can get to an apprenticeship without being an apprenticeship. On V-levels, I have a certain sympathy with the department in spite of totally recognising what Sean has said. The problem with having big qualifications, and this comes back to my point about there being this sort of very large middle group, which is not highly academic and which is also not yet making a clear choice about where they probably want to go occupationally, is that if you have big qualifications, you necessarily push an occupational choice onto people possibly earlier than they might want to. And if I go right back to the 1990s, where, as I said, most people listening have no memory or primary school or in something, we actually evaluated those very carefully. And one of the things that was actually very interesting was that these big things, these GNVQ things, General National Vocational Qualifications, were 2-year type qualifications. And guess what? They were meant to replace BTECs. But the point that I want to make is that we actually were able to follow up people who'd done them. And what was very striking was how few remained in the occupational area in which they'd taken a GNVQ, which really made you question whether that was actually the appropriate thing for them to have done. So I actually have a considerable sympathy with the idea that if V-levels are going to amount to something which actually helps to create really good higher level, last 2 years, last 3 years of essentially full-time schooling, the A-level size sort of works quite well. However, I do think Sean's point that it makes it harder to actually give a really good, well thought out, well resourced offer if you're also a town rather than a city, a relatively small institution, is a very real one. The only thing I would say is that I have been very struck over the decades now by the ability of the awarding bodies to turn qualifications into whatever it is that the DFE wants this week. And so, A-levels were all divided into AS and A-levels, and then they weren't again. So I suspect one would probably be able to get round this. Having said all that, I mean, why not have 1 and 2 year ones? I mean, honestly, why not?
Yes, it certainly seems like there's quite a lot of competing issues at play, going back to your point, Sean, around the intent versus the implementation here. Another thing we're definitely going to have to watch on the implementation side is around assessment, because the government has said we, quote, expect that V-levels will generally have an increased proportion of non-exam assessments compared to many A-levels. Now, this desire for a more applied style of assessment, such as coursework, is certainly in keeping with the intended applied nature of V-levels, which are supposed to be more practical than A-levels. But in a world of ChatGPT, I'm really struggling to see how coursework and other unsupervised projects are going to deliver those fair, reliable and credible grades that we really need students to have, regardless of what route they go after school or college. Alison, are you worried at all about the large proportion of non-exam assessment that may be heading into V-levels?
I'm very concerned. I mean, and not just because of the issues you've just covered about, whether you can deliver on quality, but because DFE, again, has a really dismal track record of creating qualifications in which the amount of time that teachers have to spend assessing is out of all proportion to what you're trying to achieve. I mean, they do this again and again and again. And I don't know if Sean is finding this with T-levels, but it's a really, really persistent and well-ingrained pattern. So when they start cheerfully with this idea of, I'm sure they have a wonderful idea about best practice in which you have plenty of safeguards against any form of tweaking of the assignments, and these wonderful teachers who basically don't sleep are going to be able to do the most extraordinary things in terms of developing the best assessment regime ever. Honestly, I think this is not sensible. And if they want to have things which are non-exam based, they need to be thinking extremely carefully about how to do something which is demanding and short and can actually be verified. Because otherwise, Tom, you're quite right, they will have no credibility at all.
Yes, the language is, of course, quite open to interpretation. When they talk about an increased proportion of non-exam assessment, the government could then say that even 20 or 40% non-exam assessment alongside lots of exams could still fit what they are describing, but we will have to wait and see. Sean, as Alison mentioned, you're running vocational qualifications such as T-levels. There have been a lot of debates over the assessment burden that T-levels have been lumbered with, which may well not have been part of the original design, but they've certainly ended up in that space. So do you think that non-exam assessments are going to work well in an applied context rather than a technical one?
I think there's a bigger question on assessment overall in the sector. And if you've ever seen that old Wallace and Gromit meme where the train's coming along and we're laying the track, it feels like that at the moment with assessment, because AI is working faster than we can work at this moment in time. So I really think there's almost an urgent cry for the sector, the wider education sector, to look at assessment as a whole. But to answer more specifically your question, there's a role for non-exam assessment in areas where we are assessing an application of skill. And that's the perfect method of assessment. But where we're trying to assess knowledge and knowledge over time, well, exams are tried and tested and reduce the burden on teaching staff and are the right method to use. Now, we shouldn't be ashamed to say that in any qualification. That comes back to the language that we use. If we're trying to create a stream of qualification against A-levels and T-levels, absolutely should be confident in saying that. It's about getting the right choice for what the outcome we are looking for. Knowledge, skill, behaviour, whatever that may be. In terms of T-level, again, it's one of those where I really worry about how we implement these. Intentions, absolutely yes, completely get that. What I see is my staff being overworked for significant periods of time. And I don't just mean the teachers who work significant hours, and I'm sure they do, despite us asking them not to, work over and above the hours that they're contracted for. It's also the support that goes alongside that. We pretty much take out an exams team for the week of uploading what should have been a non-exam assessment for T-level provision. And our numbers are relatively small in comparison because we've got alternatives at the minute. Once we don't, we're already looking at how do we need to resource that going forward. Well, that's investment, that's funding, that's taken away from the student. So I think there's an urgent need to look at assessments. But I don't think it's as simple as saying, should it be non-exam based or exam-based assessments? It should be relevant to what is the outcome we're trying to achieve, and shouldn't simply be done, which I feel it is, done as in a way that, well, you don't need to do exams, so this is a more preferential route for you. Well, that's not the right. Just because it's been difficult, it doesn't mean it's the right choice to make.
Okay, we are approaching the end of this episode, so it's time for my final question. We are told that the plan is for V-levels to go live in 2027, which is a hugely ambitious timeframe when there are still, as we've discussed today, so many unresolved issues around their role, their purpose, their design, and their positioning within the 16 to 19 education system. So, given that we are in a fast-moving policy environment with potentially some very big decisions on the way about V-levels in the near future, my question is, what advice would you give ministers and officials at this very early stage of V-level development to make sure that they don't set off on the wrong path? Sean, what words of wisdom do you have to offer from the front line of vocational qualifications?
Please, please, please work with the sector. And I mean a broad scope of the sector. Don't just play lip service to that and make sure you've got one or two people on the panel that probably come from extremely large city-based colleges, and make sure you've got a broad range of experts and as close to the front line, those who are going to be delivering these qualifications, as possible, would be my first piece of advice. Look at the challenges we've faced through all. Alison did it perfectly at the start when she explained all of the changes, and where we've seen success, very little, but where we've seen challenges throughout. And let's learn from those, because that's what we tell our students to do. Learn from our mistakes, don't we? But we've got to learn from those mistakes we've had. And really, for me, that's not in design. The intent of what we're proposing to do is strong. It's about how we implement those things. And that, for me, is in some of the things that will be significantly more when we work with the experts, but that's in the size and scope of those things. Assessment is most definitely becoming more urgent in its need. But understand that this is extremely complex. Taking 900 plus qualifications or thereabouts, and trying to get that neatly into one stream of V levels is very, very complex. Acknowledge that and work with us before you then create a deadline. It's like me saying to my team, isn't it? We're going to upheaval of all of this, and I'm going to set you the deadline, but I'm going to do none of the work. I'm just going to tell you when it needs to be done by. I don't think that's quite fair. So yeah, please, ministers, listen and work with us.
Thank you, Sean. Alison, you've done your own review for government of vocational qualifications back in 2011. You've been part of other influential reviews too. So what advice would you offer the current crop of ministers?
If you can't do 900, don't even try. Take the biggest ones, make them the ones you're doing, and actually seconding people from the awarding bodies. There will be cries of fury, you're letting the poachers in and all the rest of it. They're the ones who have to deliver it. Bring them in. They actually know how to deliver qualifications, for better or worse, and indeed to make money doing it. If you don't have them inside DFE, you will have exactly the same experience as you had with your previous attempts.
Thank you, Alison. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Alison and Sean for sharing their thoughts on what V-levels could and should be. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me in 2026 when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.